The morning Ida Merriweather walked into the Calhoun County Land Office with a hand-drawn map tucked under her arm and fire in her dark eyes. Every man inside that building went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with respect and everything to do with shock. It was the spring of 1884, deep in the Texas Panhandle, where the sky stretched so wide and so merciless that it had a way of shrinking a person down to something barely worth noticing. The land around Calhoun County was dry limestone and scrub grass and wind that never truly stopped blowing, and the only thing that made any of it livable was the Seco Creek, a thin but reliable thread of water that wound down through the hills from the north, pooling in places where cattle and horses and people could drink. That water was everything out here. Men had killed over less. Ida was 31 years old, brown-haired and square-shouldered, with the kind of face that had once been called pretty in a softer life, and was now called something harder to name, something that sat between determination and grief. She had come to Texas 3 years ago with her husband, Thomas Merriweather, who had died of fever in the second winter and left her with 40 acres, a dry goods debt, and a half-built homestead that the wind had tried its best to finish destroying. She had stayed anyway. She had stayed because leaving felt like dying twice, and she was not ready to die even once. The 40 acres she had inherited sat along the eastern fork of Seco Creek, and for 2 of the 3 years she had been working them alone, she had managed just fine. She ran a small kitchen garden, kept 8 chickens and 2 goats, and had recently begun planting a second field of sorghum that she believed, if the rains cooperated and the creek held, could actually turn her a small profit. The trouble was the creek. Specifically, the trouble was what had been happening to it upstream. Callaway Ranch. The Callaway Ranch was the biggest operation in 3 counties, some said 4, though that 4th county was more rumor than fact. It was run by a man named Sterling Callaway, who was 62, and had the disposition of a man who believed God had created the Panhandle specifically for his cattle, and that any human being standing between his herd and good water was simply an error in the divine plan. The Callaway outfit had, over the past 8 months, diverted the northern branch of Seco Creek into a series of holding tanks and irrigation channels that fed their main pasture. The result, downstream at Ida's place, was a trickle that in the dry months became almost nothing at all. She had written to Sterling Callaway twice. She had gotten no response. She had spoken to the county sheriff, a man named Dale Pruitt who owed Sterling Callaway 3 years of election support, and made it very plain that water disputes were a civil matter outside his jurisdiction. She had spoken to 2 lawyers in the town of Red Fork, both of whom had taken her money, and told her there was very little to be done. The second lawyer had had the decency to mention, on his way out the door, that Texas had adopted a form of riparian water law that might, in theory, give her a prior appropriation claim if she could prove she had been using the water longer and more consistently than the Callaway diversion. He had not offered to help her prove it. Ida had spent the winter reading. She had written to a law office in Austin and gotten a pamphlet on water rights. She had talked to old Harvey Greer, who had farmed along the Seco for 20 years before selling his land, and who remembered which families had first put in their stakes along the creek. She had gone to the county courthouse and copied out deed records by hand, working in the cold archive room by lamp, because the clerk would not let her take the documents home. And then, in the first week of March, with the creek running at barely a third of its normal flow and her sorghum seedlings fighting for survival, she had walked into the land office and filed a prior water appropriation claim against the Callaway Ranch. The clerk, a thin man named Obed Finch who wore spectacles and looked perpetually startled, had stared at her form for a very long time. "Miss Merriweather," he had said carefully, "you understand this claim is against the Callaway operation." "I understand it perfectly," she had replied. "Are you going to file it or not?" He had filed it. Word traveled the way it always did out here, faster than horses and twice as wild. By the time the weekend came, every rancher, farmer and shopkeeper in Red Fork, knew that the Merriweather widow had filed a water claim against Sterling Calloway. Opinions were divided sharply between those who thought she was courageous and those who thought she was an absolute fool, with the majority landing somewhere in the middle and preferring not to say so out loud. Sterling Calloway heard the news on a Tuesday, 3 days after the filing. He heard it at his dinner table from his foreman, a sun-hardened man named Leon Grice, who delivered information the way other men delivered blows, direct and without apology. That widow woman down on the East Fork filed a prior appropriation claim at the land office, Leon said. County's going to have to respond. Sterling set down his fork. He had a jaw like a piece of old timber and eyes the color of faded denim, and when he was displeased he went very still in a way that made the people around him feel cold. "Who handles that?" he asked. Leon shrugged. "Legally. Probably the county water board, but they're going to want a ranch representative present at any hearing, and someone's going to need to ride out there and let that woman know what she's walking into." Sterling picked up his fork again. "Send Orville," he said. There was a brief silence at the table. Seated at the far end was Orville Vaughn, the Calloway Ranch's head cattle manager, a man who had come on 3 years ago from a smaller operation near Amarillo, and had proven himself so thoroughly in the interim that Sterling had given him a salary that other ranches would have called extravagant. Orville was 34 years old, tall and deliberate in the way that men get when they have spent enough time in dangerous situations to learn the value of thinking before moving. He had dark brown hair that had gone slightly sun-bleached at the ends, a jaw covered in a week's worth of beard he kept meaning to shave, and gray eyes that had a way of looking at a problem until the problem became uncomfortable. He did not look particularly pleased at his name being called for this particular errand. "You want me to ride out to the Merriweather place," Orville said. It was not quite a question. "I want you to explain to the woman that the claim she's filed is going to be thrown out, and that pursuing it will cost her more in legal fees than her land is worth," Sterling said. "And if she doesn't take kindly to that explanation, then you'll explain it again." Orville nodded once. He was not a man who argued with his employer in front of others, but there was something in the set of his jaw that suggested the task sat uneasy with him. He had heard enough about Ida Merriweather in town to know that the creek situation was not as simple as Sterling liked to present it, and he had seen for himself, when riding the east fences, how thin the water ran down there. He had not said so to Sterling. He had told himself it was not his business. He was starting to wonder if that assessment had been correct. He rode out the next morning. The Merriweather homestead was 40 acres of stubborn determination made physical. That was the thought that came to Orville as he came over the low ridge and looked down at the place. The house was small but solidly built, the kind of construction that had been repaired and reinforced rather than built all at once, each addition slightly different in wood tone from the last, showing years of work and adaptation. There was a proper kitchen garden along the south side, still showing last year's dried stalks but with new green pushing up between them. The chicken yard was neat, the fence mended, the small barn behind the house patched and whitewashed. It was the property of someone who paid attention, someone who cared. The sorghum field was a different story. Even from the ridge he could see the patchy growth, the plants struggling in soil that should have been well watered by now. The irrigation ditch that ran from the creek to the field edge was barely moving. He could tell from this far away. He rode down. Ida was in the kitchen garden when she heard the horse. She straightened and turned, shading her eyes with one hand, and watched him come. She recognized the Calloway brand on the horse immediately. A double C burned into the left flank, and something in her chest tightened the way it always did when something she had been expecting and dreading finally arrived. She did not run inside for a shotgun. She had thought about it on the walk from the house to the garden, but had decided against it because appearing afraid was not something she was willing to do. Instead, she pulled off her gardening gloves and stood with her feet planted, waiting. He brought the horse to a stop a respectful distance from the garden fence and took off his hat, That small gesture surprised her. "Miss Merriweather," he said, "my name is Orville Vaughn. I work for the Callaway Ranch." "I know who you are," she said. "I've seen you at the feed store. You're the man who runs the cattle management." He nodded, seeming mildly surprised that she knew this. "I was sent to speak with you about the water claim you filed." Assumed as much. She did not offer him water or shade or any of the usual courtesies, though she noticed the horse was working hard and the day was warming. After a moment she relented on the horse's behalf if not his. "There's a trough around back if your horse needs water." He blinked at that. "Thank you," he said. It came out sounding genuine rather than polite, which was a distinction she filed away without quite meaning to. He dismounted and led the horse around back, and she followed at a distance. When the horse was drinking, she leaned against the fence post with her arms crossed and looked at him directly. "Say what you came to say," she said. Orville settled his hat back on his head and took a breath. He had prepared a speech on the ride over. Something about the legal complexity of prior appropriation claims in Texas, about the cost of litigation, about how the county board would almost certainly side with an established ranch over a single homestead. He had rehearsed it in his mind, careful and not unkind, and now that he was here, looking at her field and the ditch that barely moved, he found that the words felt like something he had picked up at a store that did not quite fit. He looked at the creek for a moment. The water was maybe 4 inches deep where it should have been a foot. "Mr. Callaway asked me to come out here and tell you that your claim will likely be dismissed, and that pursuing it will cost you money you probably can't afford," he said. "That's the message," she said. "What's the part that comes after it where you tell me to drop the claim?" He looked at her. "He'd like you to drop the claim." "No," she said, "just like that. Just like that." She uncrossed her arms and picked up a small rock from the fence post out of habit, turning it in her fingers. "Mr. Vaughn, I have been using that creek since before Sterling Callaway put in his second diversion tank. I have the deed dates and the county records and the testimony of Harvey Greer, who used this land before me and used this water before that. If prior appropriation means anything in this state, and I have reason to believe it does, then I have a legitimate claim. I am not dropping it." Orville was quiet for what felt like a long time. He was looking at the irrigation ditch, where a thin line of muddy water made its slow way toward the field. "Your sorghum is struggling," he said. The statement was so unexpected in its plainness that she almost laughed. "I'm aware. When did the flow drop off?" She studied him, trying to determine what manner of trap this was. He did not appear to be setting one. He appeared to be asking. "Last October when they put in the third tank. Before that the water was reduced from the summer. It's been getting worse. This spring is the worst it's been." He nodded slowly. He was doing something with his expression that she could not quite read, something between discomfort and calculation, and she found herself watching it more closely than she intended to. "I'll be honest with you," he said, which surprised her enough that she went still. "The claim you filed is not obviously wrong. Prior appropriation in Texas is complicated, but your dates are earlier than the diversion work. I don't know how a county board will rule, but it's not nothing." She stared at him. "Did Sterling Callaway tell you to say that?" "No," he said. "He told me to tell you to drop it." "Then why are you telling me this?" He looked at her for a moment, and in his gray eyes she saw something she had not expected to find there. Not cruelty, not condescension, but something more like conflict. "Because it's true," he said simply, "and I'm not much good at saying things that aren't." She did not know what to do with that. She had been preparing herself for threats, for legalistic posturing, for the kind of smooth dismissal that men with power employed when they wanted to make a person feel small without technically doing anything wrong. She had not prepared herself for honesty. "You're going to report back to Callaway that I won't drop it," she said. "Yes. And then what happens?" "He'll send a lawyer to contest the claim at the county board hearing," Orville said. "Probably the best lawyer in 3 counties, because he can afford one. And I'll have my records and Harvey Greer," she said. "And you'll have your records and Harvey Greer," he agreed, and there was something in his tone that was not quite admiration but lived close to its neighborhood. She looked at him for another long moment. The horse had finished drinking and was standing patiently, flicking its tail at a fly. The spring air was warm and smelled of new grass and dry creek mud. "Well," she said, "I appreciate that you were straight with me." "For whatever it's worth," he said. He put his foot in the stirrup and mounted, settling easily in the saddle. He looked down at her with those gray eyes, and she had the odd sensation that he was reluctant to leave, though she could not have said exactly why she thought so. "Good luck with the hearing, Miss Merriweather." "Thank you, Mr. Vaughn." He rode back up the ridge, and she watched him go, and for a while after he was gone she stood beside the half-empty trough with the small rock still in her hand, thinking thoughts she did not entirely understand. The County Water Board hearing was scheduled for the second Friday in April. It was to be held in the meeting room above the Red Fork Bank, which was the largest indoor space available for public business, and by the time the morning of the hearing arrived, the room was so crowded that men were standing along the walls and sitting on the windowsills. Ida had not expected an audience. She had not entirely thought through the possibility that a lone homestead woman filing against the largest ranch in the region would be considered entertainment. She arrived early, wearing her best dress, which was practical navy wool, and carried her documents in a leather satchel that had been her husband Thomas's. She had organized everything meticulously: the original deed with its date of filing, copies of the creek usage records she had assembled from county archives, a signed and notarized statement from Harvey Greer, and the notes from her correspondence with the Austin Law Office. She had also prepared a hand-drawn map showing the position of the Callaway diversions relative to her property, with measurements she had taken herself by walking the creek bed with a length of rope. The Callaway Ranch was represented by a lawyer named Harmon Fisk, from Abilene, who wore a suit that cost more than Ida's entire kitchen garden, and carried himself with the particular ease of a man who had never lost a case he considered important. He glanced at Ida when she sat down across the table and gave her the kind of smile that is technically polite and actually condescending, and she met it with a look so level and unapologetic that his smile flickered slightly before resetting. Sterling Callaway himself was not present. He had sent Fisk, and behind Fisk sat Leon Grice and two other ranch hands who had apparently come along for reasons Ida suspected were more social than legal. Orville Vaughn was not in the room, at least not when she first arrived. She looked for him and told herself she was not looking for him, and then told herself to stop thinking about it entirely. The board was 3 men: Judge Amos Teague, who was semi-retired and served as a hearing officer for county disputes; Elbert Moss, who ran the county surveyor's office; and a rancher named Pete Sunderman, who owned a medium-sized operation north of Red Fork and was about as neutral as the situation was ever going to get. Teague called the proceedings to order and gave both sides equal time to present their initial arguments. Harmon Fisk went first. He was smooth and comprehensive and spoke for nearly 40 minutes, citing Texas water statutes, quoting from Callaway's original development permits, and suggesting with lawyerly delicacy that while Miss Merriweather's situation was certainly sympathetic, sympathy was not the same as legal standing, and that the economic importance of the Callaway Ranch to the county and region was a matter the board might wish to bear in mind. Ida let him finish. Then she stood up. She had been advised by the Austin Law Office to keep her presentation simple and factual. She had written it out 3 times, edited it twice, and read it aloud to her goats in the kitchen garden until it sounded like herself rather than a document. She began with the dates. Thomas Merriweather had filed his original homestead claim in the summer of 1880, 4 years before the first Callaway diversion permit, and the creek usage predated even that, as evidenced by Harvey Greer's statement, which documented water use on the East Fork going back to 1872. She showed the board the map she had drawn, measured to scale, and walked them through the diversion points one by one, showing where the water left the natural channel and how much flow it removed. She cited the specific sections of Texas water law that governed prior appropriation, the same sections the Austin pamphlet had outlined, and she spoke them correctly and without hesitation because she had memorized them. She was not a lawyer. She knew she was not a lawyer, but she had done more homework than most lawyers would have bothered with, and it showed. When she finished, the room was quiet in a different way than it had been during Fisk's presentation. Fisk's quiet had been the quiet of people waiting for something to be over. Ida's quiet was the kind that comes when people are actually listening. Judge Teague asked her several questions, which she answered. Elbert Moss asked about her measurement methodology, and she explained it in detail, and he nodded with the focused interest of a man who respected precision. Pete Sunderman asked whether she had attempted to resolve the matter directly with the Callaway Ranch before filing. "I wrote to Mr. Callaway twice and received no response," she said. "I spoke to the county sheriff, who told me it was a civil matter. I consulted 2 lawyers in Red Fork, both of whom advised me my options were limited without elaborating on the prior appropriation avenue. When I researched that avenue myself, I found it applicable, and so I filed." Sunderman looked at her for a moment. "You researched the law yourself?" "I did," she said. He sat back in his chair with an expression she could not entirely decipher. "All right," he said. The board called a brief recess to confer, and Ida sat at her table and did not let her hands shake, though they wanted to. She drank from her water canteen and stared at her documents and breathed. That was when Orville came in. He appeared in the doorway during the recess, looked around the room, found her, and came directly to where she was sitting. He wore his working clothes rather than anything fancier, which told her this was not an official Callaway presence, and he was not accompanied by anyone from the ranch. He stopped at the edge of her table and looked down at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his thinking face, the one that meant he was working something out. "I heard you were presenting your own case," he said. "I didn't have much choice in the matter," she said. "How did it go?" She shrugged, though her heart was beating harder than she wanted it to. "I said what I had to say. It was thorough. I have no doubt." He sat down, not across from her where the Callaway side had been sitting, but at the far end of her table beside her, which made her blink. Several people in the room noticed and whispered. She noticed them noticing. "Mr. Vaughn," she said quietly, "you're going to create some impression by sitting over here." "I expect I am," he said, and seemed unbothered by it. "Is there something you needed to tell me?" He looked at her steadily. "When I rode back to the ranch after visiting you last week, I told Sterling that your claim was more solid than he was expecting, and that he ought to consider a compromise on the water flow. I told him a partial voluntary reduction in the diversion would look better before a board than being forced into it after a ruling." She stared at him. "You told him that." "He didn't take the advice," Orville said, "but I wanted you to know I gave it." She did not speak for a moment. Outside the window, a wagon was rattling past in the street. From behind the closed door of the side room, the board was murmuring in low voices. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. He looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. "Because what's happening to your land is not right," he said. "And I've been working for a man who's causing it, and I needed to say that out loud to someone who has reason to care about it." It was perhaps the most direct thing anyone had said to her in 2 years. She felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for longer than she could remember. "That's an unusual position to take," she said carefully, "for the head manager of the outfit you're talking about." "I'm aware," he said. She looked at him for a long time, then really looked at him, the way she had not allowed herself to do at the homestead because she had been too busy being armored. He looked back without deflecting, which was its own unusual quality. Most men, when she looked at them that directly, found somewhere else to rest their eyes. The board came back, and everyone returned to their places. Orville stayed where he was for a moment, then stood and moved to the back of the room because sitting at her table during a hearing was irregular, and he was not quite ready to be that irregular, though later he would think he should have stayed. Judge Teague cleared his throat. "The board has reviewed the materials presented by both parties," he said. "We find that the question of prior appropriation, as it relates to the East Fork of Seco Creek, presents sufficient legal standing for a formal determination." We are not in a position today to render a final ruling, as this matter requires a more detailed review of the deed and usage records. We are therefore scheduling a second hearing for the first Friday of next month, and in the interim, we are ordering the Callaway Ranch to restore the Seco Creek East Fork flow to no less than 60% of its natural volume. Harmon Fisk was on his feet immediately, objecting in several directions at once, citing the impracticality of the order and the economic disruption and the precedent it would set. Judge Teague waited for him to finish and then said, in the tone of a man who had been a judge long enough to have perfect immunity to lawyers, that the order stood pending the final hearing. Ida sat very still for a moment. 60%. It was not everything, but it was something. Something real. She pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose and absolutely did not cry in the Red Fork Bank meeting room with 40 people watching, though it required more effort than anything else she had done that day. She was packing her satchel when Orville appeared beside her again. "That's a good result for today," he said. "It is," she agreed. Her voice was steady, which she was proud of. "The final hearing is a month away. Fisk will come back stronger." "I know." She buckled the satchel and picked it up. "I have a month to get stronger, too." He walked out with her, which also caused commentary, and she was too relieved and exhausted to care about the commentary. They stood on the board sidewalk outside the bank in the spring sunshine, and he put his hat on and she turned to face him. "Thank you for what you told me in there," she said. "About speaking to Callaway." "It didn't help you much," he said. "It helped me more than you know," she said, and meant it in a way that surprised both of them slightly. She nodded once and walked toward where she had tied her horse, and he watched her go, and stood there for a long moment after she had gone, working something out that went considerably beyond water rights. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in the ordinary course of things. The interim order went into effect, more or less. Leon Grice, following Callaway's instruction to comply with the letter of the order and nothing more, opened the diversion gates enough to let 60% of the flow through to the East Fork. It was not generous, but the creek at Ida's land visibly improved, and her sorghum, which had been on the edge of failure, began to recover. She worked in the field every morning from first light to midday, transplanting and replanting where the damage had been worst, and in the afternoons she sat at her kitchen table and prepared for the second hearing. Orville began to ride past her property more often than his duties strictly required. He told himself he was checking the creek levels as part of monitoring the diversion adjustment, which was partly true and mostly an excuse. On the fourth such passage, she was in the field and she looked up and waved, a simple practical wave, and he pulled up his horse and they talked for a while over the fence about the water level and the sorghum and whether the early rains were going to hold. It was a short, uncomplicated conversation. He thought about it for 3 days afterward. On his 6th or 7th passage, she came to the fence when she saw him coming and they talked for longer. She told him about the Austin law correspondence and what she had learned, and he asked questions that were genuinely interested rather than politely obligatory, and she noticed the difference. She told him about Thomas briefly, the way she told it when it was necessary context rather than full grief, and he listened without making the uncomfortable noises people usually made. "I didn't know him," she said, "the way you know someone after 20 years. We had been married 2.5 years when he died, but he chose this land and I choose to stay on it, and that feels like something that belongs to both of us." "That's a good way to think about it," Orville said. He paused. "I lost someone too, different kind of loss. I was engaged about 4 years ago. She decided Texas ranch life was not what she wanted and she went back to her family in Ohio. It wasn't grief the way losing someone to fever would be, but it was its own thing." She looked at him. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "I made peace with it," he said. "Mostly I was sorry I hadn't seen it clearly sooner. We were not well matched, and I knew it and got engaged anyway, because that was what one does. And now you manage Sterling Callaway's cattle." "And now I manage Sterling Callaway's cattle," he agreed, with a tone in his voice that she had begun to recognize as the sound of a man reassessing his position on something. That evening she stood at the kitchen door watching the sun go down over the scrub hills and felt something she had not felt in a long time. She had not named it properly yet, but she was aware of it the way you are aware of a fire when the weather has been cold for a long time. The second hearing arrived on the first Friday of May. This time Ida had more. She had obtained, through considerable correspondence effort, a certified copy of the original Seco Creek survey from 1871, which predated every deed in question and established the creek's natural flow characteristics in the region. She had also gotten a statement from two other small farmers downstream of the Callaway diversion who had experienced the same reduction in water flow, and who had been too cautious to file themselves, but were willing to provide written testimony. Harvey Greer attended in person this time, a 70-year-old man with a remarkable beard and the kind of authority that comes from simply having been somewhere longer than anyone else. And he told the board in plain and specific language exactly how the East Fork of Seco Creek had flowed and exactly when it had changed. Harmon Fiske had brought new arguments about the economic necessity of irrigation for a ranch of Callaway's scale, and about the impracticality of restricting a major land operation's water access. He was eloquent and thorough, and Ida sat through it all with her hands flat on her documents and her face composed. When she rose to present her additional materials, she saw Orville in the back of the room. He was standing against the far wall, arms crossed, watching. When their eyes met, he gave her a single small nod that she understood entirely. She laid out the 1871 survey. She explained what it showed. She presented the statements from the other farmers. She called Harvey Greer to speak. Elbert Moss, the surveyor, examined her certified copy of the 1871 document with the focused intensity of a man seeing something he found professionally significant. He asked her where she had obtained it. She told him. He asked if he could keep a copy. She gave him one. The board deliberated for almost an hour. When Judge Teague came back and cleared his throat, the room was so quiet that Ida could hear the clock on the wall. "The board has reached a determination," he said. "In the matter of the Merriweather water claim against the Callaway Ranch, we find in favor of the claimant. The Callaway Ranch is ordered to restore the East Fork of Seco Creek to not less than 80% of its natural volume as documented in the 1871 county survey. The existing third diversion tank must be reduced in intake capacity accordingly. This order is effective in 30 days, and failure to comply will result in a formal court hearing with penalties as provided under Texas water law." Harmon Fiske was already on his feet, but differently this time, with the slightly deflated energy of a man who knows an argument is over. He would file something in district court, he said, on behalf of his client. That was his right, the judge agreed calmly. Ida sat very still and let the room dissolve around her into a blur of noise and movement. She was aware of people talking, of Harvey Greer patting her hand and saying something warm she did not quite hear, of Elbert Moss pausing to tell her she had done thorough work. She thanked them all. She held herself together with both hands. Orville was standing by the door when she came through it. He had waited for her. "Congratulations," he said. He was smiling, a real smile, the first full smile she had seen from him, and it was the kind that changed his face entirely from its usual careful arrangement into something much warmer and more open. She looked at him for a moment and felt the thing she had been aware of for weeks suddenly clarify into a name. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was less steady than she wanted it to be, but she did not mind. "Can I walk with you?" he asked. "Yes," she said, which was simple and direct and meant considerably more than its single syllable. They walked down the main street of Red Fork together, past the feed store and the hotel and the dry goods shop, and people saw them and noted it, and she did not mind that either. He walked beside her at an easy pace, and they talked about the hearing and what came next with Fiske's appeal and the practical work of monitoring the creek flow, and mixed in with those practical things were smaller personal things, remarks and observations that had nothing to do with water law and everything to do with two people discovering they like being in each other's company. At the end of the street where their horses were tied at different posts, they stopped. "I need to go back to the ranch," he said. "Tell Sterling the result. That conversation is not going to be pleasant." "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "You've been in an uncomfortable position throughout this." "I've been in a position of my own choosing," he said. "I stayed on this job because I thought the work was good work. I'm starting to think I stayed too long past the point where that was true." He paused. "That's something I need to think on." She looked at him steadily. "If you ever need to think on it somewhere other than the Callaway Ranch," she said, "you're welcome to come think on it at the East Fork." It was the most forward thing she had said to any man in 3 years. He looked at her with something in his eyes that made her very warm in the spring sunshine. "I'll remember that," he said. He rode back to the Callaway Ranch and had the conversation with Sterling, which went exactly as unpleasantly as he had predicted. Sterling called the board a collection of fools and Harmon Fiske a disappointment and the entire situation an outrage, and then turned his red face on Orville and made remarks about the wisdom of a man who had been seen walking through Red Fork with the very woman who had just cost him his full water access. Orville listened to it all without flinching. When Sterling was done, he said, "The board's ruling is the law, and it was a fair ruling." The Merriweather claim was valid. Sterling stared at him. "Whose side are you on?" "I'm on the side of what's right," Orville said. "I've been on it this whole time, I just wasn't saying it loud enough." There was a silence that lasted a long time. Sterling was a man who tolerated disagreement in small doses and defiance not at all. "You can collect your pay from Leon in the morning," Sterling said. Orville nodded once. "I'll be out by midday," he said. He was. He spent 3 days in Red Fork, staying at the hotel and doing something he had not done in 3 years, sitting still long enough to think. He had some savings. He had his skills and his reputation, and any ranch in the Panhandle would take on a cattle manager of his experience without asking hard questions. He could ride north to Amarillo and have a new position inside a week. On the 4th morning, he rode out to the East Fork instead. It was a warm May morning with a sky so blue it seemed impossible, and the Seco Creek was running at an improved flow that was visible even from the road. The sorghum field had recovered markedly in the past month. The plants were upright and green and reaching, and they looked like what they were, something that had been nearly destroyed and had decided not to be. He tied his horse at the gate post and walked to the kitchen door and knocked. She opened it almost immediately, as if she had heard him coming, and stood in the doorway with flour on her hands from baking and an expression that was surprised and not surprised at the same time. "Orville Vaughn," she said. "Ida Merriweather," he said. "You've left the Callaway Ranch," she said. It was not a question. She could tell from his expression and his bearing, from the fact that he was here on a weekday morning without his working uniform. "He let me go," Orville said. "Or I let him go. It was mutual in its unpleasantness." She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "I was just making bread." He came in. The kitchen was small and warm from the stove and smelled of bread and herbs from the bunches hanging near the window. There was a cat asleep under the table, an orange thing of great dignity, and a stack of books on the sideboard next to the flour tin. He looked at the books. "Water law," she said, following his gaze with a slight smile. "And a novel. I allow myself 1 novel at a time." "What novel?" She told him, and he had read it too, or most of it. And they sat down at the kitchen table while the bread finished rising and talked about it for longer than either had intended. And then about other things. The cattle business and the spring planting and the Red Fork community, and what Sterling Callaway was likely to do about Harmon Fiske's appeal. And the conversation had the quality of a fire that has found its proper oxygen and is content to burn without needing to rush. He stayed for the midday meal, which she offered, and he accepted. They ate bread and cold salted pork and the first spring greens from her garden at the small table, and the cat came out from under the furniture and sat beside him, which she said was unusual because the cat generally disapproved of strangers. "He's a good judge," Orville said, scratching the cat's ears. "He is," she agreed, watching him with the cat and feeling that loosening in her chest again, broader and warmer than before. After they had eaten and washed the dishes together, standing side by side at the basin, he said, "I came to ask you something. 2 things, actually." She dried her hands on the dishcloth and turned to look at him. "Ask." "The first is whether you have enough work here to need an extra pair of hands. I don't want charity and I don't want a gift. But I know cattle and horses and I know fences and irrigation, and your field is going to need proper irrigation work now that the water flow is back, and I could do that work honestly for honest wages, if you're in a position to offer it." She looked at him for a long moment. He was steady under the look, the way he always was, not performing anything, just standing in what he meant. "What's the second thing?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "The second is whether you would want to come to dinner with me in Red Fork on Saturday evening. At the hotel dining room, which is not fancy but has good beef." She watched him. He was not quite nervous, but there was something in his gray eyes that was waiting on her in a way that was not as calm as the rest of him. She found she liked knowing she had that effect. "Yes to both," she said. The thing that built between them in the weeks that followed was not swift or dramatic, which suited them both, because they were both people who had learned the value of building things properly. He came to the homestead 5 days a week and worked on the irrigation channel, redesigning the intake structure so it would make better use of the 80% flow, and directing the water more efficiently to the sorghum field. He had ideas that were good, and she had ideas that were good, and when their ideas differed they discussed it at the kitchen table over coffee until they worked out which was better, and then did it that way. He was good with her horses, too, and with the goats who were both opinionated in the way of goats, and he fixed the barn roof that had been sagging since the previous fall's wind, and mended 3 sections of fence she had put off because fence work is nearly impossible to do properly alone. She paid him in wages, which were modest but real, and he took them without argument. On Saturday evenings they went to dinner in Red Fork, and people saw them, and the town adjusted its understanding of things, which towns generally do if you give them enough time and a consistent example. The dinners were where the romance lived most visibly. He dressed as well as he could, which given his recent independence from the ranch meant cleaner clothes and a fresh shave, and she wore a dress that was not quite her navy wool, but something softer she had been keeping for occasions that had not presented themselves yet. They talked easily, the way they did at the homestead, but differently too, with more room for the personal things, for the histories and the small preferences and opinions that make up a person's interior life. She told him about her childhood in Missouri, about a father who had run a hardware store and a mother who had grown roses and read everything she could get her hands on, and about how she had come to Texas because Thomas had convinced her it was possible to build something from raw land if you were willing to work for it. He was right, she said. It just turned out to be harder than he knew, and he wasn't there for the hard part. But you were, Orville said. I was, she said simply. He told her about growing up on a ranch in West Texas, about a father who had been demanding and fair in equal measure, and who had died when Orville was 22, leaving him with skills and no land because the ranch had been sold to pay debts. He told her about learning to work for other men, about the slow progress of earning trust and responsibility, and about the strange particular loneliness of being very good at a job that belongs to someone else. Is that how it felt at Callaway's? She asked. Toward the end, he said. Not at first. At first it was just good work. What changed? He looked at his coffee cup and then at her. I think I started wanting something that was mine, he said. Something real, that meant something. She held his gaze and he held hers, and the dining room of the Red Fork Hotel went soft around the edges in the way rooms do when 2 people are the only clear thing in them. In June, Harmon Fisk filed his appeal in district court, and the matter moved to Abilene, which meant a hearing in September. This was not unexpected, But it required Ida to prepare again, and this time she and Orville prepared together. He helped her organize the documents and drove with her to Abilene for a consultation with a lawyer she had finally been able to afford, in part because the improved water flow had allowed her sorghum to develop into what looked like a genuinely productive harvest. The lawyer, a woman named Adelaide Hartwick, who was one of perhaps a dozen practicing female attorneys in the state of Texas, and who had an office and a reputation that silenced people who came in expecting to be condescending, reviewed Ida's case and said it was substantially sound and that she would take it to the district court for a fee Ida could manage. Riding back from Abilene in the wagon, with the flat plains spreading around them in every direction and the late afternoon light turning everything gold, Orville reached over and took her hand. He did it simply, without announcement, the way you reach for something that makes sense to reach for, and she let him hold it. And they sat that way for a long time without speaking, with the horses walking at an easy pace and the grasshoppers singing in the dry grass on both sides of the road. "I've been thinking," he said after a while. "About what?" she asked. "About land," he said. "The section north of yours up toward the ridge, the one that Henderson put up for sale last winter. It's good grazing ground and it's creek adjacent, which is going to matter more and more as the county fills up." She looked at him sideways. "You've been looking at the Henderson section." "I've been looking at it," he said carefully, in the context of thinking about things. He paused. "About what a person does when they want something that's theirs." She was quiet for a moment. The horses plodded on. A hawk circled distantly over the ridge. "The Henderson section is adjacent to my north fence line," she said. "I know," he said. "That would make them effectively a single operation," she said. "It would," he said, "if the people on each section were interested in operating together." She looked at him fully then, and he looked back at her, and the wagon went on rolling through the golden afternoon, and she understood clearly and entirely what was being said between them, not all of it aloud, but all of it real. "I think," she said carefully, "that would depend on the specific arrangement." He was quiet for a moment. "I think the arrangement I'm thinking of is a fairly permanent one," he said. "The most permanent kind if you were interested in something like that." She was quiet for a long moment. Not because she was uncertain. She realized with a clarity that felt like the creek running full after a long dry season. She was quiet because the moment was a big one and she wanted to let it be the size it was. "I might be interested in something like that," she said, "if it were asked properly." He looked at her and his gray eyes were warmer than she had ever seen them, warmer than she had known they could get. "I'll ask properly," he said. "Give me until Sunday." It was Thursday. Sunday came. He arrived at the homestead in the morning wearing his best shirt, and with the orange cat watching with great solemnity from the fence post. And he knocked at the kitchen door, even though she had seen him coming from the window and was already there. She opened the door and he was standing on the step with his hat in his hands, and a look on his face that was so completely undefended that it made her heart feel like it was both too full and too light at once. "Ida Merriweather," he said, "I came here in March intending to fight you and sat down instead, and I have not yet found a single reason to stand back up. I don't want to find one. I want to stay. I want to stay on your side of this particular fence for as long as you'll have me, in whatever arrangement makes the most sense to you. But what makes the most sense to me is to marry you and work this land with you and make something together that belongs to both of us." He paused. "Will you?" She stood in the kitchen doorway with the smell of coffee and bread behind her and the spring morning in front of her, and this man on her step who had said the truest thing she had heard in years. "Yes," she said, "I will." He put his hat back on his head and smiled that full open smile, and she stepped down off the kitchen step, and he kissed her, properly, with both hands on her face. And the cat on the fence post regarded them with supreme indifference, and the creek ran clean and full over the stones. They were married in September, 3 weeks before the district court hearing in Abilene, by the Red Fork pastor in a small outdoor ceremony beside the creek at the East Fork, with Harvey Greer and his wife as witnesses, and a handful of neighbors and friends from town. Ida wore a cream-colored dress she had sewn over the summer, and Orville wore his cleanest suit, and a look on his face that Harvey Greer later described to his wife as the look of a man who cannot believe his luck and is trying to be quiet about it. The ceremony was simple and direct, like both of them, and when it was over they stood in the September sunshine on the bank of the Seco Creek, which was running at a good healthy flow and catching the light off its surface in a way that made it look like something more than water. The district court hearing went well. Adelaide Hartwick was worth every cent of her fee. She presented the case with a precision and authority that left Harmon Fisk looking somewhat diminished, and the district judge, a man named Samuel Brecht who had a reputation for ruling on the actual merits of things, affirmed the county board's determination and dismissed the Callaway appeal. The 80% flow order stood. It was now district court law. Sterling Callaway did not take it graciously, but he was a man who understood the law as a wall when it was turned against him, and he stopped fighting. The diversion was adjusted to compliance within the 30-day window, monitored by Elbert Moss from the county surveyor's office, who rode out personally with a measuring instrument and a great deal of professional satisfaction. Orville had purchased the Henderson section in August, shortly after their engagement, using his savings and a modest loan from the Red Fork Bank that he expected to pay off in 2 years given the cattle potential of the North Pasture. The section ran along the ridge and down to the creek's north bank, which meant that between his land and Ida's, they had close to 200 acres of workable ground, creek access on 2 sides, and a plan. They spent the fall working together on the land. He brought 10 head of cattle from a sale in Abilene good stock and began a proper grazing rotation on the north section. Ida's sorghum harvest that October was the best she had ever had, better than she had dared hope during the worst of the dry summer, and when she stood in the field with the cut stalks at her feet and the full sky above her, she felt something so profound and whole that she had no word for it except something close to completed. In the evenings they sat at the kitchen table together, the same table where she had sat alone for 3 years working out water law by lamplight, and they talked and planned and sometimes just read their separate books in comfortable proximity, and the cat slept under the table, and the fire ticked in the stove, and the Seco Creek ran past the east fence in the dark outside, steady and reliable as everything they were building. There were challenges, as there always are. The winter of 1884 to 1885 was hard, with a sustained cold spell in January that killed 2 of their 10 cattle and froze the water troughs solid for a week. They worked through it together, breaking ice at the troughs every morning before dawn and supplementing the herd's feed from the sorghum harvest stores. There were fence losses from the wind and a bout of respiratory illness that took Ida out of commission for 2 weeks in February and drove Orville to an anxious level of caretaking that she found both touching and occasionally excessive. "I don't need broth every 2 hours, she told him from her bed, where she was propped against pillows looking considerably better than he felt she looked. "You do," he said, bringing her broth. She accepted it. "Orville, Ida, I'm going to be fine." "I know," he said, and then sat on the edge of the bed and held her hand for a while without saying anything else, because the 2 weeks of her illness had frightened him in a way he was still working through, and she knew it, and she let him hold her hand for as long as he needed. She recovered fully by the end of the month, and by March she was back in the kitchen garden with the first spring plantings, and he was riding the north pasture checking on the cattle, and they were both exactly where they were supposed to be. In the spring of 1885, Ida realized she was expecting a child. She told Orville on a Tuesday morning at breakfast, with the straightforward plainness that characterized her approach to important things, setting his coffee in front of him and sitting down across the table and saying, "I believe we are going to have a child in October." He went very still in a way she had come to recognize as his version of being overwhelmed, not a frightened still, but a full still, the kind where everything inside a person is doing too much at once for the outside to keep moving. Then he looked up at her with those gray eyes, and the expression in them was so completely undone and so full of something enormous that she felt tears come to her own eyes, which happened to her somewhat less often than to other people and therefore meant more when it did. "October," he said. "Give or take," she said. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his. He did not say a great deal more. He did not need to. The grip of his hand said it entirely. The pregnancy progressed well, which Ida attributed to healthy living, and Orville attributed to the same, while quietly praying every morning in a way he did not advertise. The summer was productive, with the cattle herd expanding by 4 calves, and the sorghum field benefiting from a series of well-timed rains and the improved irrigation system that now properly served the entire east section. Harvey Greer came by regularly with his wife Martha, who was a capable, practical woman with considerable knowledge of childbearing and an opinion on everything, which Ida found mostly useful and occasionally overwhelming. Martha taught her several things about preparing for a birth in a situation that was not close to a doctor, and Orville listened to all of it from the next room with great attentiveness. They also hired help. Orville brought on a young hand named Pedro Castillo, 16 years old, from a family in Red Fork who were known to be hardworking and decent, and who had a natural ease with horses that was obvious from his first week. Pedro came 6 days a week, ate the midday meal with them, and was paid fairly and treated with the kind of respect that Orville had never received from Sterling Calloway and was determined to give to the people who worked with him. Ida noticed how Orville treated Pedro, the way he taught without condescending and trusted without being careless, and it told her things about who he would be as a father that filled her with a quiet and specific joy. The baby came on the 14th of October, 1885, just at the edge of autumn, when the sorghum was harvested and the air had turned sharp and the Seco Creek ran dark and clear in the mornings. Martha Greer was there, and the Red Fork doctor, who had made the 12-mile ride when Orville had gone to town at first light to get him. It was a difficult labor of 12 hours that Ida managed with the same dogged, practical determination she brought to everything, and Orville stayed in the house the whole time because leaving was not something he was capable of, pacing the kitchen while the cat observed him from the counter. When Martha came out and told him the news, his face did the thing it had done when Ida told him about the pregnancy, the overwhelmed, complete stillness, and then he was through the door and at her side. Their son was born healthy, all lungs and indignation, with a head of dark hair and hands that seemed remarkable in their smallness and perfection. They named him Thomas Orville Vaughn, Thomas for the man who had first brought Ida to this land and who deserved to be remembered in it, and Orville for his father, because Ida insisted on it and because it was right. Holding his son for the first time, standing beside the bed where Ida lay tired and luminous and more beautiful to him than anything he had ever seen, Orville felt the architecture of his life rearrange itself around this moment. Everything that had come before, the ranch jobs and the lost engagement and the slow, lonely building of competence without belonging, rearranged itself into a path that had led here, to this small, warm room beside this woman and this child, and he felt the particular quiet that comes when a person has found the exact place they were headed without knowing they were headed anywhere. "He looks like you," Ida said, watching him hold the baby. "He has your chin," Orville said, "and your expression. He looks like he's already annoyed at something." She laughed, which was the best sound in the world. "That is purely your contribution," she said. In the years that followed, the Vaughn homestead, as it was known in Red Fork, grew into something that people pointed to with a kind of quiet admiration. Not because it was the largest operation in the county, it was not, and was never intended to be, but because of the particular quality of the thing being built there. The cattle herd expanded steadily to 50 head, all well managed and healthy. The sorghum operation grew and diversified, with Ida adding a kitchen herb operation that supplied several of the Red Fork restaurants and a small stand in the weekend market. The irrigation system that Orville had redesigned became something of a local reference, with neighboring farmers coming to look at it and asking questions. Pedro Castillo stayed on and became, by the time he was 20, a genuinely skilled cattleman who brought a friend to work with him, a young man named Ramon whose family had been in the Panhandle before almost anyone else, and who knew things about the land and the seasons and the way water moved through limestone that were invaluable. Orville learned from both of them without embarrassment, because learning from people who know things is not a weakness, and he had always understood that. The water rights remained secure. Sterling Calloway died in the spring of 1887 in his bed and without making peace with the judgment against him, which was his own choice and his own loss. His son, a quieter and more reasonable man named James Calloway, took over the ranch and came to visit the Vaughn homestead in his first month of ownership to introduce himself, and to say that he had reviewed his father's legal history and intended to honor all existing court orders. He and Orville shook hands and got on tolerably well, which was all that was required. Ida filed no more claims and needed to file none. The creek ran at proper levels, watched by Elbert Moss's office with regular measurements, and the East Fork of the Seco continued to water the sorghum field and the kitchen garden and the livestock, and the home of two people who had built something real from dry limestone and stubbornness, and the particular grace of having found each other at exactly the right time. In the winter of 1887, Ida told Orville over breakfast, in the same matter-of-fact way she had told him the first time, that they were expecting again. Their son Thomas was 2 years old and had already developed an opinion on horses that was bordering on obsessive. He sat in his small chair at the kitchen table with breakfast on his face and looked at his parents with dark eyes that were exactly his mother's. "July," Ida said, when Orville did the familiar overwhelmed stillness. "July," he repeated. "You might want to practice saying it like someone who was expecting it," she said. "I was expecting it," he said. "You look like you were hit by a wagon." "A very good wagon," he said, and came around the table and kissed her, which Thomas watched with the solemn interest of a 2-year-old witnessing something he does not yet have vocabulary for. Their daughter was born in July of 1888, on a hot afternoon with a thunderstorm moving in from the west that broke the heat just as she arrived, which Orville took as an appropriate weather event. They named her Clara June Vaughn, after Ida's mother and the month that had almost been her birth month, and she arrived with considerably less labor trouble than her brother had caused and considerably more volume, a detail that suggested strong opinions from the start. She was correct. Clara grew up opinionated and direct and entirely unintimidated by anything, qualities that caused her parents to exchange private looks of combined pride and mild concern on a regular basis. Thomas was a serious and deliberate child who began following his father around the cattle operation almost as soon as he could walk reliably, and by the time he was 5 had an understanding of cattle management that embarrassed several adults. Orville taught him with patience and thoroughness, and a complete lack of the demanding perfectionism his own father had employed, and Thomas absorbed everything with the focused quiet of a person taking in what they love. The homestead grew, too, physically. They added 2 rooms to the house in 1886, a proper bedroom with real windows and a reading room that served as Ida's office and library and occasional second sitting room, with bookshelves that were the finest piece of furniture Orville had built with his own hands. He was not a natural carpenter, but he was a determined one, and the shelves were solid and true, and she arranged her books on them with a pleasure so complete it made him laugh. "You look like Thomas with a new horse," he said. "These are better than a horse," she said, and he knew she meant it and did not argue. In the evenings, after the children were in bed and Pedro had ridden home, and the ranch was settled and quiet, they sat in the main room with the lamp between them and read or talked, or simply, occupied the same air in the way that people do when they have made a real home together. The cat, whose name turned out to be Senator, though no one was certain why, lived to a magnificent old age and was eventually succeeded by two younger cats of no particular distinction, who learned to respect the memory of their predecessor by behaving well. Sometimes Ida would look up from her book and find Orville watching her, not in the anxious, observant way he had watched her at first, at the hearing and across the fence and in the hotel dining room, but in the way of a man who is entirely present in the life he is living and cannot quite believe how fortunate that life is. She understood the feeling exactly, because she felt it too, regularly, looking at him across the kitchen table or the sorghum field or the creek bank where Thomas was wading in the shallows, and Clara was informing everyone within earshot of her assessment of the water temperature. There were hard days, because life has hard days. There were winters that took cattle and springs that brought flooding and the ordinary griefs of any life lived in a place that does not accommodate softness. There was a summer when the creek ran lower than the court order technically required, and Ida drafted a firm letter to Elbert Moss's office, and the water levels were corrected within the week. There was a year when the sorghum failed almost entirely due to an insect infestation, and they tightened the budget and made it through without selling land or debt they could not carry. Through all of it, they were fundamentally on the same side of things, which is perhaps the most important quality a marriage can have. Not that they agreed on everything, they did not. They disagreed regularly on everything from cattle breeding philosophy to how long the reading room lamp was appropriate to leave burning, and these disagreements were spirited and occasionally loud, and always resolved, because neither of them found it natural or comfortable to leave things unresolved. In the spring of 1890, on a warm morning when the creek was running high and clean from the winter snowmelt, and the kitchen garden was showing its first green, Orville and Ida stood together on the creek bank watching their children play in the shallows. Thomas was 4.5 years old and had walked into the water up to his knees with the serious expression of a scientist conducting research. Clara was nearly 2 and had walked directly in up to her waist before either parent could intervene, apparently convinced that water depth was a social convention that did not apply to her specifically. "Clara," Orville said. "No," said Clara, which was her most frequent response to most things. Ida was laughing, the real full laugh that she did not use often but that was, in his opinion, the best sound he had ever heard, and that he tried deliberately to earn at least once a day. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood there in the spring morning with the creek running past, and their children in the water and the homestead behind them on its 40 acres, plus the Henderson section to the north, plus the 50 head of cattle and the sorghum field and the kitchen herb garden and the bookshelves and the cat and Pedro and Ramon and Harvey Greer, who still came over Sundays, and all the rest of the life they had built together on the banks of the Seco Creek in the Texas Panhandle. The land that had been dry and struggling was well watered and productive. The claim that had seemed impossible was district court law. The man who had ridden up to fight had sat down instead, and in sitting down had found the truest thing in his life. She tilted her head back against his shoulder and looked at the sky, which was doing its wide, impossible Texas thing, blue from edge to edge without apology. "Thomas," Orville called, "do not let your sister walk further in." Thomas reached over and took Clara's hand with the slightly put-upon patience of an older sibling. Clara objected. Thomas held on. "He'll be a good rancher," Ida said. "He'll be whatever he wants to be," Orville said. "He wants to be a rancher. He told me yesterday morning at considerable length." Orville laughed. "Then he'll be a good rancher." Clara had decided that the objectionable depth of the creek was actually satisfactory, and had stopped fighting Thomas's grip, and was now investigating a smooth stone on the creek bed with great interest. The Seco ran clear and cold around their small feet and went on downstream, the way it had always gone, the way it would keep going, through the limestone hills and the scrub grass and the wide, impossible country, carrying everything it needed to carry. Ida turned to look at him, right there beside her, where he had been standing for 6 years now and showed no intention of going anywhere. He was looking at the children, his face open and warm and completely without armor, the face she had been watching long enough now to know every expression it made and love all of them. "You sat down instead," she said. He looked at her. "What? When you came to fight me, you sat down instead?" He considered this. "I sat down," he said, "at your table at the hearing on your side of the fence. I couldn't seem to stop doing it." "I'm glad you couldn't," she said. "So am I," he said, and meant it with everything he had, which was considerable and growing. He kissed her there on the creek bank in the spring morning, with their children splashing in the cold, clear water and the homestead steady and warm behind them and the wide sky overhead. And the seco ran on, and the land was good, and the water was theirs, and everything had been built properly, from the ground up, by two people who had deserved each other from the moment one of them sat down. The creek would run for 100 years after them, and the records at the Calhoun County Land Office would show a water claim filed by one Ida Merriweather in the spring of 1884 against the Callaway Ranch, the first and most important piece of paper in a long legal history that changed how water was managed in that county and in the ones around it. People cited it for decades, but that was the public record. The private one was simpler and more complete. A kitchen table with books on one side and coffee on the other, two children and a cat of remarkable dignity, a creek that ran full and clear through 40 acres plus the Henderson section to the north, and two people who had started as opponents in a water dispute and ended up as the best thing either of them ever found. The orange cat sat on the fence post in the morning sun and observed all of it with the knowing calm of an animal who has watched something good come together and is entirely satisfied with the result. The creek ran. The sorghum grew. The children laughed. The sky was enormous and entirely itself, blue without apology, over the whole wide working world of them. And that was enough. That was, in the best possible way, entirely enough.